There once was a man who had everything. Millions in the bank, properties that touched the sky, respect from those around him. But something in his eyes didn't match his fortune, a shadow that no money could buy or sell. Because this millionaire carried wounds so deep they would have destroyed most people. Betrayals that marked him, losses that broke him inside, life's blows that left him bleeding in silence. And here's what's strange, he had all the power to return every blow, resources to destroy those who hurt him, influence to make every person who caused him pain pay. But he didn't. Instead, he chose something few understand. Something that goes against our most primitive nature. He decided to turn his pain into inner strength, his wounds into wisdom, his rage into a discipline that transformed him into something greater than his circumstances. This is the story of how a wounded man became a stoic millionaire, not despite his pain but because of it, and why his decision not to hurt anyone made him more powerful than any revenge could have. Because in the end, true wealth isn't in what you can destroy, but in what you can build from the ashes of your own suffering. Everyone carries scars. But not all wounds are equal. Some are small scratches that heal with time. Others are deep cuts that change the way we walk through the world. And then there are wounds that don't bleed outward but inward. Those that no one sees but that transform everything we touch. He knew them well. He had collected them over years of misplaced trust, unrequited love, sacrifices that were never recognized. Each betrayal had left a mark. Each loss had carved a groove in his soul. The first great wound came when he was young. A partner he had trusted with his future left him with debts that nearly destroyed him. He didn't just lose money, he lost his faith in humanity. He learned that words can be weapons and contracts don't always protect the heart. The second came disguised as love. A woman he loved with all his soul abandoned him at his most vulnerable moment. She taught him that hearts can break in ways that time can't always repair. The third was the cruelest. His own father, the man who was supposed to protect him, betrayed him for money. He showed him that blood isn't always thicker than greed. But here's the difference between him and most wounded people. Instead of allowing these wounds to define him, he decided to study them. He examined them like a scientist examines specimens under a microscope. What did all these betrayals have in common? What did they teach him about human nature? How could he use this knowledge to never be vulnerable in the same way again? That's when he discovered Stoicism. Not as an abstract philosophy, but as a practical tool to transform pain into power, to convert wounds into wisdom. The Stoics knew something most ignore, that suffering is optional, that we can choose how we respond to what happens to us, that our reactions are the only territory we truly control. Marcus Aurelius had written, "You can remove the sting from any suffering if you stop adding the judgment that it's bad for you." And he began to understand that his wounds weren't his destiny, but his building materials. Each scar became a lesson. Each betrayal an opportunity to develop inner strength. Each loss a reminder that the only true wealth is what no one can take from you, your character. Because emotional wounds have a unique power. They can destroy us or transform us. They can make us close ourselves to the world or open us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. He chose transformation. And that choice changed everything. The path wasn't easy. There were days when the pain was so intense he could barely breathe. Nights when the memories attacked like wolves. Moments when giving up seemed like the only logical option. But every time he was about to surrender, he remembered something Epictetus had written. It's not what happens to you but how you react to it that matters. And he chose to react with growth instead of bitterness. With learning instead of resentment. With transformation instead of victimization. His resilience wasn't born from strength, but from the daily decision to be stronger than his circumstances. His auto-discipline wasn't natural talent, but the conscious choice to control what he could control and accept what he couldn't. Slowly, his wounds stopped being his weakness and became his wisdom. His pain stopped being his prison and became his path to freedom. His emotional scars stopped being his shame and became his strength. He had learned the most powerful secret, that we're not defined by what happens to us, but by what we choose to do with what happens to us. That true power isn't in avoiding pain but in transforming it. That authentic strength isn't in never falling, but in how we rise after we fall. The wounded man was beginning to become the healed man. Not because his wounds had disappeared, but because he had learned to use them as fuel for his personal transformation. There's a moment in every wounded man's life where he faces a crossroads. A moment where the pain becomes so intense that the only response that seems natural is to strike back. He reached that moment. He had resources. He had connections. He had information that could have destroyed the lives of those who betrayed him. He could have ruined the partner who scammed him. He could have publicly exposed the woman who abandoned him. He could have confronted his father in ways that would have left him with nothing. The temptation was real, visceral. He could feel how rage ran through his veins like sweet poison. The promise of justice, of balance, of making others feel the pain he had felt. But there was something more powerful than rage: self-discipline. The Stoics teach that discipline is the difference between being a slave to our emotions and being their master. That true freedom doesn't come from doing what we want, but from consciously choosing what we do. Seneca had written, "All cruelty springs from weakness." And he began to understand that revenge wasn't a show of strength, but of weakness. That returning pain was admitting that others had power over him. Revenge is seductive because it promises relief. It tells us that if we make those who hurt us suffer, we'll find peace. But it's a lie. Revenge doesn't heal wounds, it infects them. It doesn't bring justice, it brings more pain. He had seen other millionaires use their power to destroy their enemies. He had seen how the thirst for revenge consumed them from within, how they became prisoners of their own hatred. And he decided he wouldn't be one of them. Instead of planning attacks, he planned his growth. Instead of studying his enemy's weaknesses, he studied his own. Instead of seeking ways to hurt, he sought ways to heal. This didn't mean being passive. It didn't mean forgetting or automatically forgiving. It meant taking control of his response. It meant choosing his destiny instead of letting others choose it for him. Because revenge is a prison. It ties you to the people who hurt you. It forces you to live in the past. It turns you into a reflection of their pain instead of a creator of your own future. He wanted something bigger than that. He wanted a life where his energy went toward construction, not destruction. Where his power served to create, not to devastate. The Stoics call this the discipline of desire. The ability to want what we have instead of being consumed by what we don't have. To find satisfaction in our own actions instead of in others' reactions. And this discipline became his superpower. Because while others spent their energy on empty revenge, he invested it in his personal transformation. While others weakened themselves with hatred, he strengthened himself with containment. The temptation of revenge never completely disappeared. But every time he felt it, he used it as an opportunity to practice self-discipline. To remember who he had decided to be. Containment became his secret weapon. While others wore themselves out in emotional reactions, he accumulated energy. While others revealed their cards with every explosion, he kept his strategies in silence. He learned that every time he didn't react, he gained valuable information. Every time he contained himself, he observed patterns others didn't see. Every time he stayed silent, others revealed more than they intended. But containment also had a cost. It required constant inner strength, daily discipline, the ability to feel pain, rage, frustration, and choose not to feed them. There were days when the pressure was almost unbearable. When every fiber of his being screamed for a reaction. When the temptation to explode was almost irresistible. In those moments he remembered Epictetus's words, "You are an actor in a play. If it's short, it's short. If it's long, it's long. If the author wants you to be poor, act poverty with dignity. If he wants you to be rich, act wealth without arrogance." He had decided to act his role with dignity. No matter how much pain he felt inside, no matter how many wounds he carried, no matter how many times he wanted to scream. Containment became his identity. People began to see him differently. Not as someone who had been hurt, but as someone who had chosen how to respond to his hurts. His employees respected him more. His competitors feared him more. His allies trusted him more. Because containment generates respect. When people see you can control your emotions, they trust you can control more complex situations. When they see you don't react impulsively, they know your decisions are thoughtful. He was becoming something more than a millionaire. He was becoming a Stoic. Someone who had learned that real power isn't in what you can do to others, but in what you can do with yourself. There exists a transformation few know about. An emotional alchemy where pain becomes gold. Where tears crystallize into wisdom. Where wounds transform into scars that tell stories of survival. He discovered this alchemy when he stopped running from his pain and began to study it. Every night, in the solitude of his study, he sat with his wounds like a researcher sits with specimens. He examined them without judgment. He dissected them without mercy. He understood them without drama. What had he learned from each betrayal? How had he grown from each loss? What strengths had he developed in response to each exposed weakness? The Stoics teach that everything that happens to us is material for our growth. That there are no good or bad experiences, only experiences we can use to build ourselves up or tear ourselves down. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, Today I will meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. He didn't say it with bitterness but with preparation. He knew life would bring pain and he had decided to use that pain as fuel. He began to see his emotional wounds as his personal university. Each betrayal had been a masterclass on human nature. Each loss had been an intensive course on impermanence. Each pain had been an opportunity to develop emotional muscles others didn't have. His partner's betrayal taught him to trust but verify, to build systems where people couldn't hurt him, not because he was paranoid but because he was intelligent. His beloved's abandonment taught him about emotional independence, that his happiness couldn't depend on another person, that true love began with loving himself. His father's betrayal taught him that even blood can be toxic, that family isn't always a refuge, that sometimes we must create our own families with people who choose to be with us. Each lesson had been painful, but each lesson had also been valuable. He began to see pain as information, as data he could use to make better decisions, to build a more solid life, to develop an inner wealth no one could steal. This alchemy wasn't instantaneous. It required time, patience, and an iron determination not to let pain corrupt him. It required the discipline to process each experience without becoming cynical, to learn without becoming cold. The Stoics call this amor fati, love of fate. It doesn't mean enjoying pain, but accepting that everything that happens to us can be used for our growth. He didn't love having been betrayed, but he loved the strength he had developed in response. He didn't love having lost his father, but he loved the independence he had found. He didn't love having been hurt, but he loved the compassion he had developed toward other wounded people. This alchemy of pain became his competitive advantage. While other millionaires protected themselves from suffering, he had learned to transform it. While others avoided difficult experiences, he sought them because he knew they would strengthen him. His inner strength wasn't built with steel and concrete, but with decisions and discipline. Every morning at 5 a.m. before the world woke up, he sat in his study with a cup of coffee and a notebook. Not to plan the day but to build his inner fortress. First tool, Stoic meditation. It wasn't meditation to relax but to train, to practice difficult scenarios in his mind, to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. He imagined losing all his money. How would he react? What would he do? How would he maintain his dignity? He imagined being betrayed again. How would he respond? What lessons would he apply? How would he protect his inner peace? Second tool, the Stoic journal. Every night before sleeping he wrote 3 things. What did I do well today? What could I have done better? What did I learn about myself? It wasn't self-pity or self-flagellation. It was emotional auditing. It was conscious character building. It was the daily practice of personal transformation. Third tool, physical discipline. He knew that mental and physical strength were connected, that a weak body could betray a strong mind, that self-discipline in small things built self-discipline in big things. This construction of inner strength wasn't a weekend project. It was a lifetime commitment. It was the daily decision to choose growth over comfort, strength over ease, character over convenience. Pain was no longer his enemy. It was his teacher, his tool, his fuel for a deeper and more meaningful life. There exists a paradox few understand. To be truly strong, you must first be vulnerable. To be invincible, you must first accept that you can be hurt. He discovered this paradox when he realized his greatest strength didn't come from hiding his wounds, but from acknowledging them. For years he had used his success as a mask, his wealth as armor, his power as a shield. He thought that if he accumulated enough of these external things, he could protect himself from internal pain. But emotional wounds have a peculiar characteristic. The more we hide them, the more power they have over us. The more we deny them, the more they control us. The more we avoid them, the more they pursue us. The Stoics knew this. Seneca wrote, "The wound that is hidden is the one that hurts the most." He wasn't talking about physical wounds but wounds of the soul, of the pains we carry in secret, of the scars we pretend not to have. The first step toward true strength was recognizing his vulnerability, admitting he had been hurt, accepting that he carried scars, confessing that there were moments when the pain was almost unbearable. This didn't mean becoming a victim. It didn't mean dramatizing his suffering. It meant being honest with himself about his human experience. He began to talk about his wounds, not to generate pity but to process them, not to victimize himself but to humanize himself, not to weaken himself but to strengthen himself. He discovered something surprising. When he spoke about his wounds honestly, others responded with respect, not contempt. When he showed his vulnerability, people trusted him more, not less. Because authentic vulnerability is magnetic. It connects us with other human beings. It reminds us that we all carry wounds, that we all struggle with pain, that we all need healing. But there was a crucial difference between vulnerability and victimization. Vulnerability recognizes pain but takes responsibility for the response. Victimization uses pain as an excuse not to grow. He had chosen conscious vulnerability, the ability to say, "Yes, I've been hurt. Yes, I carry scars. But I'm determined to use these experiences to grow, not to stagnate." This vulnerability became his superpower. Because when you're honest about your weaknesses, you can work on them. When you recognize your wounds, you can heal them. When you accept your pain, you can transform it. People began to see something in him they didn't see in other millionaires: authenticity. Not the performative authenticity that's become so common, but real authenticity. Brutal honesty with himself. The best leaders aren't those who have never fallen. They're those who have fallen, gotten up, and learned to help others do the same. He understood this when one of his youngest employees came to his office with tears in his eyes. He had made a mistake that cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. He expected to be fired. He expected to be humiliated. He expected his career to end before it began. Instead, he found understanding. "Tell me what happened," he said, without a trace of anger in his voice. The young man told him the whole story. The errors in judgment. The hasty decisions. The pressure he had felt. The fear that had paralyzed him. When he finished, he remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "When I was your age, I lost much more than that from a similar mistake. The difference is that no one taught me what to do afterward. You have the opportunity to learn from this. To grow. To become someone better." That day, the young man not only kept his job, he gained a mentor. And he realized he had found his true calling: authentic leadership. Leadership from scars is different from leadership from privilege. It's more human, more real, more effective. Because when you lead from your wounds, you understand others' pain. When you lead from your mistakes, you have patience with others' mistakes. When you lead from your vulnerability, you inspire real trust. His meetings changed. Instead of being one-way presentations where he talked and others listened, they became conversations where everyone contributed. Where mistakes were discussed openly. Where lessons were shared generously. His hiring decisions changed. He stopped looking only for technical competence and began looking for character. He stopped hiring only those who had never failed and began hiring those who had failed and learned. His company transformed. Employees stopped fearing making mistakes and began taking calculated risks. They stopped hiding problems and began solving them collaboratively. They stopped working from fear and began working from purpose. His scars had become credentials. His wounds had become tools. His pain had become power to help others. He had discovered that the most powerful leadership doesn't come from perfection, but from transformation. Not from never having fallen, but from knowing how to get up. Not from never having been hurt, but from knowing how to heal. There exists a freedom that can't be bought with money. An independence that isn't measured in bank accounts. An autonomy that doesn't depend on external circumstances. It's emotional independence. He discovered it when he realized he had been living his emotional life as if it were a thermostat controlled by others. His mood depended on how they treated him. His self-esteem depended on what others thought of him. His peace depended on circumstances he couldn't control. He was a millionaire in money but poor in emotional autonomy. The Stoics teach that we are slaves to whatever we cannot lose without being disturbed. And he realized he was a slave to others' approval, to others' reactions, to external circumstances. Epictetus, who had been literally a slave, wrote, "No one can hurt you without your permission." He wasn't talking about physical wounds but emotional ones. About others' ability to affect our internal state. The first step toward emotional independence was reclaiming responsibility for his reactions. Stopping blaming others for how he felt. Stopping waiting for others to change so he could be well. He began to practice what the Stoics call the discipline of judgment. The ability to separate facts from interpretations, events from emotions, what happens from what it means. When someone criticized him, instead of reacting automatically, he asked himself, what part of this is true? What part is opinion? What part is my interpretation? When someone rejected him, instead of taking it personally, he analyzed, does this say something about me or about them? Is this useful information or emotional noise? How can I use this to grow? When things didn't go as expected, instead of getting frustrated, he reflected, what can I control here? What must I accept? How can I adapt? This practice wasn't easy. It required constant vigilance, daily self-correction, the discipline to pause before reacting, to think before feeling, to choose before exploding. But gradually something changed. Others' opinions stopped dictating his self-esteem. Rejection stopped destroying his confidence. Criticism stopped ruining his day. Not because he had become insensitive, but because he had learned to process emotions instead of being processed by them. There are two types of millionaires in this world: those who are rich in money but poor in soul, and those who have discovered the inner wealth that no crisis can touch. He had been the first type for years, accumulating zeros in bank accounts while his emotional account was in the red, buying properties while his most valuable property, his inner peace, was mortgaged to suffering. Inner wealth doesn't appear on financial statements. It's not traded on exchanges. It can't be transferred by inheritance. But it's the only wealth that really matters when everything else disappears. Inner wealth is built differently from material wealth. It's not accumulated by acquiring but by releasing. It's not multiplied by adding but by subtracting. It's not protected by hiding but by sharing. First account of his inner wealth: wisdom. Every painful experience had become knowledge. Every mistake a lesson. Every wound understanding about human nature. Second account: strength of character. Years of practicing self-discipline had built emotional muscles that didn't weaken with time. The ability to do what's right when it's difficult. To maintain his values when it's inconvenient. Third account: compassion. His own wounds had made him sensitive to others' pain. Not in a way that weakened him, but in a way that genuinely connected him with other human beings. Fourth account: perspective. Having lost and gained, having been hurt and healed, had given him a perspective money can't buy. The ability to see situations from multiple angles. To understand that everything is temporary. Fifth account: authenticity. Years of removing masks had revealed who he really was. Without pretenses. Without performances. Just the raw and beautiful truth of his imperfect but growing humanity. Sixth account: inner peace. The ability to be well with himself regardless of external circumstances. To find tranquility in the midst of chaos. To maintain balance when everything is shaking. This inner wealth had unique characteristics. The more he used it, the more it grew. The more he shared it, the more it multiplied. The more he gave it, the more he received. It couldn't be stolen by thieves. It couldn't be destroyed by economic crises. It couldn't be devalued by inflation. It couldn't be lost through bad investments. His bank account could fluctuate. His investments could go up or down. His properties could gain or lose value. But his inner wealth kept growing, because he had learned to invest in the only thing that really matters: himself, in his character, in his soul, in his ability to find meaning and purpose regardless of circumstances. He had become an inner millionaire, and that was wealth no one could touch. There exists an art few master. An art more difficult than painting, more complex than music, more refined than sculpture. It's the art of not hurting when you've been hurt. He learned it slowly, painfully, through trial and error. Because the natural impulse when we're hurt is to hurt back. It's the law of the jungle. Primitive justice. Apparent balance. But there was something more powerful than revenge: the conscious choice to break the cycle. The Stoics teach that we're responsible for our actions, not for others' actions toward us. That we can choose how to respond regardless of how others act. That our dignity doesn't depend on others' dignity. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself." The first challenge came when his ex-partner, the one who had betrayed him years ago, needed help. His new company was bankrupt. His reputation was destroyed. His family was suffering. He had every reason to refuse. Every justification to turn his back. Every excuse to enjoy his fall. Instead, he extended his hand. Not because he was a saint. Not because he was weak. But because he had understood something fundamental. Hurting others hurts us. Seeking revenge turns us into what we hate. Returning pain only multiplies pain in the world. He offered an interest-free loan. He helped rebuild his reputation. He taught him the lessons he had learned since his betrayal. His ex-partner couldn't understand it. "Why are you helping me after what I did to you?" His answer was simple: "Because who I am doesn't depend on what you did. It depends on what I choose to do." The second challenge came with his father. The man who had chosen money over his son. Who had betrayed the most sacred trust. Who had caused wounds that seemed impossible to heal. His father was old now. Alone. Sick. The years had taken their toll for his selfish decisions. He had the power to ignore him. To let him suffer the consequences of his actions. to turn his back as his father had turned his back on him. Instead, he visited him in the hospital, not to reconcile completely, not to pretend the pain hadn't existed, but to demonstrate that he could be better than the circumstances that had formed him. He paid the medical expenses. He ensured he had dignified care. He offered forgiveness not because his father deserved it, but because he needed to give it. In a world that screams constantly, he had learned the power of silence. Not the silence of one who has nothing to say, but the silence of one who has learned when to speak and when to remain quiet. The silence of one who understands that the most powerful words are sometimes those that aren't spoken. The first moment of powerful silence came during a meeting where a competitor verbally attacked him in front of important investors. The attack was personal, cruel, designed to provoke an explosive reaction. Everyone expected him to respond, to defend himself, to counterattack with the same ferocity. Instead, he remained silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a dignified silence. A silence that communicated more than any words could have. His attacker collapsed. His words lost power when they found no resistance. His aggression evaporated before the serenity of silence. After the meeting, the investors approached him. "Your silence was more powerful than any response," they told him. "You showed class when others showed their lack of it." He had discovered that silence is a form of power. That not reacting is a reaction. That not defending yourself can be the best defense. He began to practice strategic silence. When criticized unfairly, he remained quiet and let his actions speak. When provoked, he responded calmly or didn't respond at all. When attacked, he kept his dignity intact. The art of not hurting became the most beautiful art. Because in a world full of pain, choosing not to add more pain is a revolutionary act. In a society that celebrates revenge, choosing compassion is true courage. He had become a master of the most difficult art, the art of healing instead of hurting, of building instead of destroying, of loving instead of hating. And in that art he had found the most complete freedom. Some men leave buildings as legacy. Others leave money. Others leave names on bronze plaques. He had decided to leave something different, living proof that personal transformation is possible. He hadn't planned to become an example. He hadn't sought to be inspiration. He had simply chosen to heal instead of hurt, to grow instead of stagnate, to transform instead of be a victim of his circumstances. But people began to notice. Employees who had worked for other millionaires commented on the difference. "I've never seen someone with so much power be so human," they said. "I've never seen someone so successful be so accessible." Competitors who expected to find a ruthless successful businessman were surprised by his integrity. "He competes hard but plays fair," they murmured. "He wins but helps others win too." His story began to circulate, not as gossip but as hope. The story of the millionaire who had been deeply hurt but had chosen to heal, who had been betrayed but had chosen to trust again, who had fallen but had risen stronger. Young entrepreneurs sought him out, not just for business advice but for life wisdom. "How did you do it?" they asked. "How did you transform so much pain into so much strength?" His answer was always the same: one decision at a time, one day at a time, one wound at a time. He began to write. Not dramatic memoirs, but honest reflections on the process of personal transformation. About how he had applied Stoic principles to real situations. About the daily struggles no one saw. His writings resonated because they didn't promise easy solutions. They didn't sell instant happiness. They spoke of hard emotional work, of daily discipline, of the constant choice to grow instead of give up. The Stoic narrative had become his way of life. Not as abstract philosophy, but as practical tools to navigate reality, to transform obstacles into opportunities, to convert wounds into wisdom. His companies began to reflect his values. They hired not just for competence but for character. They promoted not just for results but for integrity. They created cultures where mistakes were learning opportunities, not reasons for punishment. His leadership style became studied. Business schools analyzed how he had created loyalty without fear, respect without intimidation, results without toxicity. But the most powerful legacy wasn't in his companies or his writings. It was in the people he had inspired to transform their own lives. The employee who had come crying about his mistake had become an exceptional leader. The ex-partner who had betrayed him had rebuilt his life with integrity. Dozens of people had seen in him proof that change was possible. His personal transformation had become an invitation for others. Without preaching, without evangelizing, simply living as an example that no matter how hurt you've been, you can choose to heal. No matter how fallen you've been, you can choose to rise. personal development had become his true wealth. Not because he was perfect, but because he was authentic in his growth. Not because he had no problems, but because he had learned to handle them. People saw in him something they rarely see. A millionaire who had used his success to become a better person, not a more powerful person. Someone who had found a way to be prosperous externally without losing his soul internally. His dark philosophical life channel had found its deepest purpose: to demonstrate that personal transformation isn't a luxury for the privileged, but a possibility for anyone willing to do the work. No matter how much money you have or don't have. No matter how many wounds you carry. No matter how many times you've fallen. Transformation is always possible. One decision at a time. One day at a time. One choice at a time. He had become living proof of this truth. And that was the greatest wealth he had accumulated. Years later, he found himself in a place he never expected, teaching others how to transform their pain into power. Not formally. Not as a guru or motivational speaker. But simply by being living proof that wounded people can choose to heal instead of hurt. His office had become a sanctuary for broken souls. Young entrepreneurs who had been betrayed by partners. Executives who had lost everything in bad investments. Fathers who had been abandoned by their children. Sons who had been rejected by their parents. They came to him not because he promised easy answers, but because he offered something more valuable: the evidence that healing was possible. Each conversation was different, but the pattern was always the same. Anger. The desire for revenge. The temptation to give up. The choice between becoming bitter or becoming better. He never minimized their pain. He never told them to get over it or move on. Instead, he shared his own wounds, his own struggles, his own moments of wanting to give up. "I understand," he would say. "I've been where you are. The pain is real. The anger is justified. The desire for revenge is human. But there's another path. A harder path, but one that leads to freedom instead of prison." He would tell them about the Stoics. About Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire but struggled with his own demons. About Epictetus, who was a slave but found freedom in his mind. About Seneca, who was wealthy but found richness in his character. But more than philosophy, he offered them a living example. A man who had been hurt deeply but had chosen not to hurt others. Who had been betrayed but had chosen to trust again. Who had fallen but had risen stronger. His influence began to spread. People he had helped began helping others. His employees took his lessons to their own families. His business partners applied his principles in their own companies. A culture of healing began to emerge around him. Not forced or artificial, but organic and authentic. People who had experienced transformation naturally wanted to share it with others. His company became known not just for its profits, but for its values. Not just for its success, but for its soul. Job candidates came not just for the salary, but for the culture. Clients chose them not just for their services, but for their integrity. He had created something rare in the business world. A company that made money while healing people. That succeeded while serving others. That grew while helping others grow. But the most profound impact was in the lives he had touched directly. The young man who had made the costly mistake had become a mentor to other young professionals. The ex-partner who had betrayed him had started a foundation for failed entrepreneurs. Dozens of people had taken their own pain and transformed it into purpose. He had started a chain reaction of healing. A circle of transformation that expanded beyond what he could have imagined. The wounded millionaire had become the healing millionaire. Not by denying his pain, but by transforming it. Not by avoiding his wounds, but by healing them. Not by forgetting his past, but by using it as fuel for his future. He had learned that the greatest wealth isn't in accumulating resources, but in multiplying healing. That the truest power isn't in dominating others, but in empowering them. That the most lasting legacy isn't in what we build, but in whom we help rebuild. 10 years after his transformation began, he faced the ultimate test. The man who had hurt him the most, his father, was dying. The call came at 3 a.m. His father's voice, weak and trembling, barely recognizable. "Son, I don't have much time left. I need to see you." For a moment, the old wounds reopened. The memories flooded back. The betrayal. The abandonment. The choice of money over family. The years of silence and resentment. Every fiber of his being wanted to hang up. To let his father die alone as he had left him to live alone. To give him the same indifference he had received. But then he remembered who he had become. The man he had chosen to be. The principles he had lived by. The transformation he had undergone. He drove through the night to reach the hospital. His father looked smaller than he remembered. Fragile. Human. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so intimidating, so capable of causing pain, was now just an old man facing mortality. "I'm sorry," his father whispered. "I was wrong. I chose money over you. I chose greed over love. I've regretted it every day since." The apology he had waited decades to hear had finally come. But surprisingly, he realized he no longer needed it. His healing hadn't depended on his father's recognition. His peace hadn't required his father's repentance. "I know," he said simply. "I forgave you years ago. Not because you deserved it, but because I deserved peace." They talked through the night. Not about the past, but about the present. About the man his father was dying as, not the man he had lived as. About redemption. About second chances. About the possibility of finding meaning even in our final moments. His father died 3 days later. Peacefully. With his son by his side. At the funeral, he spoke not about the man his father had been, but about the lessons his father's life had taught him. About how pain can be transformed into wisdom. About how our worst moments don't have to define us. About how it's never too late to choose love over resentment. Standing there, looking at the few people who had come to say goodbye, he realized something profound. His father's greatest gift to him hadn't been love or support or guidance. It had been the wound that forced him to find his own strength. The betrayal that taught him to rely on himself. The abandonment that showed him the importance of choosing who to trust. Every wound had been a teacher. Every betrayal a lesson. Every loss an opportunity to grow. He had become who he was not despite his father's failures, but because of them. His father had given him the greatest gift possible, the motivation to become better than his circumstances. This wasn't about justifying abuse or romanticizing pain. It was about understanding that we can choose what to do with whatever life gives us. That we can use our wounds as weapons or as wisdom. That we can let our pain define us or refine us. As he left the cemetery, he felt something he hadn't expected: gratitude. Not for the pain his father had caused, but for the strength he had discovered in response to that pain. Not for the wounds he had received, but for the healing he had chosen. He had passed the ultimate test. Not by being perfect, but by being human. Not by never being hurt, but by choosing how to heal. Not by avoiding pain, but by transforming it. The wounded millionaire had become the healed millionaire. The hurt son had become the whole man. The victim had become the victor, not over others, but over his own circumstances. He had learned the most powerful truth, that we're not defined by what happens to us, but by what we choose to do with what happens to us. That healing is not about forgetting the past, but about not letting the past control our future. That forgiveness is not about condoning wrong, but about freeing ourselves from resentment. He drove home that night with a peace he had never felt before. The kind of peace that comes not from having all the answers, but from having lived all the questions. Not from avoiding suffering, but from finding meaning in it. He had become living proof that transformation is possible. That healing is achievable. That we can choose to break cycles of pain instead of perpetuating them. The man who had been hurt deeply had chosen not to hurt deeply. The man who had been broken had chosen to rebuild. The man who had been betrayed had chosen to trust again. And in making those choices, day after day, wound after wound, he had become something rare. A millionaire who was rich not just in money but in character. Not just in resources but in resilience. Not just in power but in peace. His story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because now he understood his true purpose. To show others that no matter how deep your wounds, no matter how great your pain, no matter how impossible your circumstances seem, transformation is always possible. One choice at a time. One day at a time. One healing at a time. He had become what the world needs most. Proof that wounded people can choose to heal instead of hurt. That broken people can choose to rebuild instead of destroy. That hurt people can choose love instead of revenge. The millionaire Stoic had been hurt, but he chose not to hurt anyone. And in that choice, he found the greatest wealth of all. The wealth of a life well lived, a character well built, and a legacy well earned. 5 years had passed since his father's death. 5 years of living as a man transformed, not by avoiding pain, but by alchemizing it into wisdom. His company had grown beyond financial success. It had become a model for conscious capitalism. A place where profit and purpose coexisted. Where success was measured not just in revenue but in the lives transformed. Employees stayed not just for the salary but for the culture. They brought their friends. They recommended the company to their family members. They spoke about it with pride, not just as a place to work but as a place to grow. Business schools sent students to study his leadership model. How did he create loyalty without fear? How did he generate results without toxicity? How did he build an empire while maintaining his soul? The answer was always the same: by choosing healing over hurting, by choosing growth over revenge, by choosing transformation over victimization. But the true measure of his legacy wasn't in business metrics or case studies. It was in the letters he received, the messages from people who had heard his story and decided to write their own different ending. A woman whose husband had abandoned her and their children. Instead of seeking revenge, she had chosen to build a life of dignity and purpose. She had become a successful entrepreneur and a role model for single mothers. A man whose business partner had stolen everything from him. Instead of plotting revenge, he had chosen to start over with integrity. He had built a new company based on trust and transparency. A son whose father had been absent and abusive. Instead of perpetuating the cycle, he had chosen to be the father he never had. He was raising his children with love and presence. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same. Pain transformed into purpose. Wounds alchemized into wisdom. Victims choosing to become victors not over others, but over their own circumstances. He had started a quiet revolution. Not with manifestos or movements, but with the simple decision to live differently. To show that another way was possible. His influence had spread like ripples in a pond. From his employees to their families. From his business partners to their communities. From those he had helped directly to those they had helped in turn. A network of healed healers had emerged. People who had been hurt but had chosen not to hurt others. Who had been broken but had chosen to rebuild. Who had been betrayed but had chosen to trust again. They didn't wear badges or hold meetings. They simply lived as examples of what was possible. They showed up in their communities as lights in the darkness. As proof that cycles could be broken. As evidence that transformation was real. His own journey had come full circle. The man who had been wounded by those closest to him had become a source of healing for strangers. The man who had been betrayed by his partners had become a mentor to young entrepreneurs. The man who had been abandoned by his father had become a father figure to many. He had learned the deepest secret of the Stoics, that we're not just responsible for our own character, but for the character we inspire in others. That our choices create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. Marcus Aurelius had written, "What we do now echoes in eternity." He had lived that truth. His choice to heal instead of hurt was echoing in the lives of thousands of people he would never meet. On quiet evenings, sitting in his study, he would reflect on the journey. The boy who had been hurt so deeply. The young man who had been consumed by anger. The businessman who had discovered the power of transformation. The mentor who had learned that the greatest wealth is in what we give, not what we take. He wasn't perfect. He still had moments of pain. Still carried scars that occasionally ached. Still faced challenges that tested his resolve. But he had learned something most people never discover. That perfection isn't the goal. Transformation is. That we don't have to be flawless to be valuable. That our wounds, properly processed, can become our greatest sources of strength. The millionaire Stoic had been hurt, but he chose not to hurt anyone. And in that choice, he had found something more valuable than all his wealth combined. The knowledge that he had lived with integrity. That he had broken cycles instead of perpetuating them. That he had chosen love over revenge, healing over hurting, transformation over stagnation. His legacy wasn't in the buildings he had constructed or the money he had accumulated. It was in the lives he had touched. The people he had inspired. The cycles he had broken. The hope he had kindled. He had become living proof of the most radical idea, that wounded people don't have to wound others. That hurt people don't have to hurt people. That those who have been broken can choose to become healers instead of harmers. In a world that often seems defined by pain passing from person to person, generation to generation, he had shown another way. The way of the wounded healer. The way of the transformed transformer. The way of the one who chooses to be the change they want to see. The millionaire Stoic had been hurt, but he chose not to hurt anyone. And in that choice he had discovered the most profound wealth of all. A life that mattered. A story that inspired. A legacy that would long outlive him. Because the greatest fortune isn't in what we accumulate for ourselves, but in what we contribute to others. The truest success isn't in what we achieve despite our pain, but in what we create because of it. He had transformed his deepest wounds into his greatest gifts. His most painful experiences into his most powerful teachings. His darkest moments into lights that guided others home. The man who had been hurt had chosen not to hurt. And in that choice, he had found the secret to a life truly worth living. If you felt this content touched something within you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who also needs to hear this. Leave in the comments, what part marked you the most? This helps the channel continue to exist. and you help other people be reborn in silence.